My name is Oliver Pickard, and I've always dreamed of building my own car, together with my aerospace engineer and rallyist dad, Andrew. Hello. I found the perfect project. This is my Cox GTM. The remains of one of only 800 made. And that looks bad, but when you look at it from the inside, it's even worse. Crashed, fire damaged, rusted, unrestorable. We aren't just modifying, but completely re-engineering. We aren't just bolting on parts, we are making the tools that fabricate the parts to build my dream car. Bespoke, one of one. This is Project Mosquito.
Hello!
Hello!
And welcome to the workshop. In this week's video, we're going to be doing some steering stuff. So Dad's going to do some splaining while I go and get some kit, and then you can actually see what we're on about.
So we're going to mount our rack, and we're going to make sure we have no bump steer, because bump steer on a car is it's dangerous.
What is bump steer?
Bump steer is when the suspension travels up or down, and it actually turns the wheel of the car when you don't move the steering wheel. So basically, if you got really bad bump steer on a bumpy road, the car basically darts everywhere.
Now, our front suspension is Mazda MX-5 or Miata or Unos Roadster, if you prefer. And that's great. But our steering rack is from a Mini. And it's kind of from a Mini. It's an aftermarket racing steering rack from a Mini. It's a quick rack, which is why we're using it. And we're using it upside down and backwards, so that our left-hand drive car has a right-hand drive steering rack. The reason is, in a Mini, the steering rack is behind the wheels, but in an MX-5, the steering rack is in front of the wheels, so it needs to be the opposite way around. But as you can see, we have a little problem, because it's got arms like a T-Rex. It does. The good news is that because we're a mid-engine car, we don't actually need to change our steering arms. A lot of people out there go with a front upright that uses a bolt-on steering arm and then make some bizarre convoluted steering arm. And the good news is on a mid-engine car, you don't need to do that, because you've got all this room for activities. Look at all this space. If it was a mid-engine car, if it was a front-engine car, you'd have an engine here, you'd have a radiator, you might have a power steering pump in the way, you'd have a sump, you'd have all these things that are in the way of mounting your rack where it needs to be. But because we're a mid-engine car, it can go anywhere. So we can place it in exactly the perfect place for our suspension, which just happens to be almost identically where the MX-5 rack was. Being that this is MX-5 suspension, our diameters are pretty much the same, and we haven't actually changed things that much, although we have increased caster, haven't we?
Yep, we've now got 8 degrees of caster.
So, we need to, unfortunately, make some adapters.
No big deal.
These are the first adapters that are on this entire car.
And the reason for that is the Mini steering arms are 1/2-inch UNF, whereas the MX and the MX-5 ball joints are 12mm, 125mm pitch. So obviously they don't go together, and they're too short. So
Dad's going to knock up some adapters on the lathe.
Yep.
And then we can get into doing bump steer and measurements and Ackermans and stuff. Right, let's get cracking.
what we're going to do is get the rack centered, and then we know how long to make our new extensions.
In fact, can I just interject and say, this just shows you how much wider this car is than a standard GTM. This is how much the track width has widened.
Yep.
30 centimetres.
Yeah.
A foot. So this car is an entire foot wider in track width than it used to be. If you don't know what track width is, we'll be using that term a lot in this video. It's quite simply the space between the centre line of this wheel and the centre line of that wheel in width. I've had comments in previous videos being like, why is your dad always using the lathe? Why aren't you using the lathe? And the reason for that is because it's dad's lathe. It's your baby, innit?
Yep. It might be a little bit rough and ready, a little bit old-fashioned, but it does the job.
If it were any older, it'd be made of stone.
In fact, I used to work for a company where I used a lathe, and to give you some size of scale, there used to be a seat on the tool post here, and I could literally sit on the seat on the tool post.
And we got the lathe at the same time, this lathe, at the same time as we bought the Mosquito originally. The van that we rented to pick the Mosquito, we actually used the day before to go and get this. And the reason for that is when I was, well, all my entire life, Dad has always been like, what I want is my own lathe. I mean, forever. As long as I've been a thing.
Yep.
And so I got my sports car that I've always wanted, and Dad got his lathe that he's always wanted. And it's much like the Mosquito, it's a work in progress.
Yeah, we'll get there eventually.
But it's still your lathe, isn't it?
Yeah.
And even if we weren't doing Mosquito stuff, you would still be using your lathe.
Yeah.
Like, that's why Dad's always using the lathe, because I'd never get a look in, I never get a chance. For as long as Dad has been making his adapters, I've been looking in my stash of bits for 2 Imperial lock nuts for these steering rod ends. And I finally found 2. Unfortunately, they're both from the mini subframe, one from one side, one from the other, from the same place, and one's thick and one's skinny, for reasons known only to itself. So, Dad chucked some metric nuts in the lathe and he's actually drilled and tapped them, so we now have Imperial threads on a metric nut. So if ever I have to change them, I can using just metric spanners. How cool is that?
Let's get it started in there. Same with this one.
Yep. So there we have it. High tensile steering rack extensions. It helps that 1/2 inch is 12.8mm, and of course the MX5 rack is 12mm. So it's roughly a similar size. So it doesn't look that out of place. And once these are screwed all the way in and the lock nuts are on, it'll be absolutely perfect. It's basically just a metric rack now. The next job is to make a jig, because what we need to be able to do is adjust up our steering rack and put it in exactly the right place for 0 bump steer. This is our suspension jig. If you don't know what a jig is, it's something that allows you to get everything in place without being in the way. So this allows us to get to the point where we have no bump steer, because we can extend it, we can shorten it, we can raise it, we can lower it, we can pivot it, we can move it in any direction we want. Then, when we finally have our position, our final position where we have no bump steer, we can tighten everything up and it'll hold it all in place, because our clamping area for our rack is here. So in the next episode, when we make our mounts, we can make our mounts and all of this will stay out of the way. But for now, we need to jack the car up, we need to take the wheels off, and we need to do a lot of measuring, because this is just the beginning. Ready? Added weight to the thing, it's heavier.
Go on there yourself. That's one under.
It's a good job I can touch my toes. Every single job in this car's like pulling your socks up. It's the problem with building something so small. We're not going to be using this weird rubberized universal joint thing because it's got too much squish in it, but to turn a steering rack it comes in handy. And one of my stipulations for this car, one thing that I really wanted, was I wanted a lot of lock, because the original GTM steering doesn't give a lot of lock, because on a Mini you have universal joints and stuff to contend with. But I think you'll agree that that is not so bad. So we'll have a much better turning circle even though we're using a mini rack, which is quite cool. 0.99. I made the assumption that because we've got all MX-5 suspension, our rack should be in roughly the same location as an MX-5 rack. I forgot to account for the fact that our track width is 40mm wider than an MX-5, which is 3/4 of an inch if you're that way inclined. So we are 20mm aside wider, and therefore our rack needs to be in a vastly different place. It's been some considerable time.
Yep, quite frustrating.
Not really. It's just laborious.
Laborious. Yeah, you've got to move it, measure it, measure it again.
I'm not putting all of those hours of footage of us kind of jacking one wishbone of a car up and down into this video. Just, it's not worth it. But just trust that it's been a long time, and just it's really boring work, but it's really worth getting this stuff right. And we use 2 spirit levels simply just to get our eye in and to kind of get within a ballpark, didn't we?
Yeah.
Because use one vertically, one horizontally, and that'll get it, because of the length of the spirit level, it accentuates the curve, doesn't it? And gets you somewhere near. But now we can bust out the modern technology.
Yes, the high-tech laser.
High-tech alignment solution. The €2.50 cat laser that I use to exercise the cat when it's raining. That's it. That's as expensive and as high-tech as we're getting. But one laser is as good as another.
Yep, it all goes in a straight line.
Yep.
Whether you pay £1,000 for one or €2.50.
Yeah, I've had this for years.
They do exactly the same thing.
So what we're going to do is we're going to strap this laser to our wishbone, and we're going to jack it up, and then hopefully it goes in a reasonably straight line. You can't get it. There's no such thing as zero bump steer with a
double wishbone and a solid rack setup.
Well, what's the rack called? It's called a rack and pinion. Zero bump steer with a rack and pinion's impossible, isn't it?
Well, I'd say your average, a good sports car gets about 0.4 to 0.6 of a degree bump steer.
You can get it really close, and that's what we're hoping for. But I will say that if you're doing this at home and you just happen to have CAD, a lot of people ask me about CAD. I must get about between like 5 and 10 messages a week about people asking me what's a good CAD software. You may have noticed
we don't use it.
All of this car has been done on pen and paper, and I'm quite adamant for most stuff. Like the McLaren F1 was done on pen and paper entirely. Like for most stuff, you don't need CAD unless you're sending stuff off to be made for you.
Which we don't do either. Everything's made here.
No, exactly. But in this one circumstance, having CAD makes it less time consuming. It doesn't make it any
less. It easier. It just makes it quicker.
It makes it less time consuming, yeah. CAD is as good as the person using it. It only knows what you tell it, right? But in this circumstance, if you measure out all of your suspension points, your rack sits in relationship to all of your other ball joints. And so it's really easy on a screen to just drag, like, put in lines to all your ball joints and then just like drag your rack about with your mouse until it all lines up. And some CAD programs will actually just do it for you. Like, oh, make this line up, and it just goes click, and it's all bob on, and then you just have to follow its instructions. You don't need it. You can do it like this.
We've done it.
Yeah. But fingers crossed, we've got it.
Yep.
Right. Let's tape this button down on this mouse because it doesn't keep itself on, and pop it in the thing. So this is our system. We have our laser pen mounted to our upright, and we have a straight edge, well, a spirit level that is exactly 2,000 millimeters away from the hub center to make our maths easier. The suspension's under a jack, and there's a straight line drawn on that spirit level. As I jack the suspension up, the laser dot should trace a straight-ish line up the spirit level, and the distance it wanders from that line is how much bump steer we have. Okay, going up. I'm sure this is thrilling television.
Okay.
Yep. So how much have we wandered there? How much have we wandered from one line?
Go from our line and measure it across. Four and a half millimeters.
It's at this point I really need to give a shout out to Omni Right Angle Calculator. We work our bump steer out as a function of a right angle triangle. And tools like this are absolutely indispensable because knowing the maths is great, but if you're doing this 30 times, like doing all the maths gets really dull, and people who make tools like this for free online are just amazing human beings, and I just want to give them a shout out because I really do appreciate them, because I've done this more than 30 times. And yeah, if I hadn't have had this tool, I don't know what I would have done. So how much did we drift?
We got 4.5 millimeters.
4.5 millimeters,
Drift.
and we are 2,000 millimeters away, which gives us angle A 0.12 degrees.
And as I said before, a good car, a good production sports car, if you get between 0.4 and 0.6, it's pretty damn good. But to get this result is absolutely fantastic.
It's not nothing, but it's incredibly nothing adjacent.
So you've got to think it's 4.5 millimeters, but it's two fit. You know, it's 6'6" away.
Yeah, and can we also appreciate that this is not an MX-5 steering rack? This is an upside down mini steering rack that's the best bit of 50 years old. And it's mated to MX-5 suspension, which has been widened by 40 mil. What's that?
Just nearly inch and 5/8.
So it's been widened by inch and 5/8. It's an imperial steering rack from a classic racing Mini, and none of this should go together. And these are MX-5 factory ball joints. They aren't.
They're not even the ball.
They're not the improved ones. Yeah. Mazda had trouble with bump steer in the sports models of the MX-5 that were equipped with, I think, the Bilstein suspension. And they made special ball joints, which if you have to buy them today, they're like 140 quid.
Is that a pair?
No, I don't know. They're super expensive anyway. They are more than you want to spend. Let's put it that way. That, you know, for people who have cat laser in the budget, they aren't exactly budget friendly, and we've managed basically for free, other than the only money we've spent in this video other than our time is the high tensile steel for making these extenders. That's it.
And before anybody points out about the rack, we turn the rack to 180 degrees because while we were adjusting it about, we didn't want the spigot to be anywhere near the chassis. So we just for convenience, we flipped it over, but it's a perfect circle, it's a tube, so it can just flip back without altering anything.
Well, this is the beauty of our jig. Now we can hold it all together in the correct place, because in the next episode, we are going to be making our steering rack mount. Because I don't know if you noticed, but this was quite a long video. We've spent days doing this. And I'm giddy. I'm absolutely over the moon with this result. It could not be a better result. And now, like I say, it can be held all in place. We can make our mount, and then we can flip this around in an orientation where it's not going to run into anything, because we don't have our universal rag joint thing yet to fit on the end, because the one that we had is unacceptably squishy.
Yeah. I went to all the trouble of solid mounting the rack to the chassis, so...
I'm not a big fan of like solid mounting stuff. Like we've made sure that we've used like engine mounts that I've given them. We're using suspension bushes rather than rose joints, and we're using ball joints rather than rose joints in our steering, because I don't like rose joints. I don't like metal on metal pivots on a road car. They're just not a good idea. They don't last, do they?
It's not. They transmit loads of vibration.
Yeah.
And it spoils the road car.
When they're brand new, they're superb. After 6 months, they are far worse. On a road, they are far worse than a rubber bush. But we are solid mounting the rack, and that is because I'm on a mission to have the ultimate in steering feel.
Yeah.
There's no point in doing all of this if you don't have like the world's most awesome steering feel.
Yeah.
And so that's why we're solid mounting the rack. And I know there's going to be some people out there that will be like, I'd put it on rubber bushes because vibration, but I want that. I want like running my hand across the surface of the road type steering feel. I'm sure there's going to be a lot of questions about Ackerman and Ackerman geometry. If you don't know about what Ackerman is, a really super basic explanation is when a car goes around a corner, all four wheels need to travel different distances and different speeds, because they are all at different distances from the apex of the turn. So every single wheel travels a different distance at a different speed. And when you've got two wheels turning in at the front, one wheel needs to be able to turn in more than the other in order to complete that radius, right? That's a super, super basic explanation. And when you do this, a perfect Ackerman is when if you draw an imaginary line through these two ball joints and those two ball joints, and then through this steering ball joint, and you come back, it's where this line intersects with that imaginary line. So the two would point as a triangle, and if you have perfect Ackerman, it would line up to the center point of your rear track width. A lot of people will say differential, but it should be your rear track width, right? Because we don't have a differential, well, we do, it's over here. So that's how perfect Ackerman works. Now, we are very lucky because an MX-5 has fantastic Ackerman. It's one of the reasons why I chose it. It has very good Ackerman, and the front suspension has no scrub, right? That's superb. Scrub is when we draw a mythical line. That mythical line that we drew down here before is called the KPI, or Kingpin Inclination Angle. And the distance from the center point of your tire to the Kingpin Inclination Angle point, if there is one, is called a scrub radius, right? And that scrub radius, a Mini has a small scrub radius, and that fights you when you steer. They wanted an MX-5 to be able to be driven around a car park by a lady of 75 without the use of power steering. So an MX-5 has really good Ackerman, and it has really good kingpin inclination angle. In fact, the kingpin inclination angle is to the very center of that tire contact patch, and there is absolutely no scrub. And much like TLC, I don't want no scrub. So we've gone for a tire spec, a wheel and tire spec
that also has no scrub. And you may have heard me mention in a previous video, the rear also has no scrub. However, this is not an MX-5, this is not a Miata, and this is not an Unos Roadster. It is 40mm wider at the front, and the wheelbase is 40mm shorter. What does that do to all of our angles? Well, in a perfect world, everything would be easy, and there'd be an Ackerman would be perfect and everything, but it's not. There's very many different kinds of steering alignment. So the three main kinds are, when it's within the back wheels, that's called Pro Ackerman. When it is absolutely perfectly lined up with the back wheels, that is called parallel geometry. And when it is outside of the back wheels, it is called anti-Ackerman. Why would you want your wheels to point in completely the wrong directions when you're going around a corner? So why would you want the wheel that's supposed to be turned in more, turned in less, and the wheel that's supposed to be turned in less, turned in more? That's called slip angle. The reason for that is slip angles, because when you have your wheel, when people talk about tyres often, and they talk about the science of tyres, they only talk about the compound, right? And that's like the hardness of the rubber. But that's not the full story, because a tyre is not a solid block of rubber. It's got air in it. It's basically a stiff bag filled with rubber. And when you turn your wheel, the wheel turns and the tyre doesn't turn as much because of sidewall deflection and things like that. Obviously, the tread has grip, and when you turn, you have to fight some of that grip. So, you may turn your wheel, I don't know, 10mm, and your tyres may turn 10mm, but the actual tyre contact patch itself might only turn 4mm, or might only turn 6mm. And there is a difference, and the difference between the angle of your steering and the angle of where the tyre is actually pointing is called slip angle. Thank you. I lost the word. Now then, tyres with a high slip angle are more predictable. So softer sidewall tyres are way more predictable and they're far less snappy, right? But you only want anti-Ackerman on a formula car. If you've got super sticky slicks that will not be moved and you're on a super high speed track, that's when you want anti-Ackerman, right? So perfect Ackerman is for like an octogenarian lady with no power steering going around a car park. Anti-Ackerman is for a Formula One car. And somewhere in the middle is us. So somewhere in the middle, you want a happy medium between both. This is a lot of information coming at you very fast, and I know it's a lot, right? But basically, by widening and shortening the front steering geometry of an MX-5 in relation to the back of the car, what you get is an imperfect triangle. So we have Pro Ackerman, right? But it's not to a perfect point anymore. It's now open like this, which is actually a very good thing because this will be a lot faster than an MX-5. It will be a lot faster than a Miata. You know, you're talking something that will more than keep up with, if not pass, a Ferrari F40 under 140 miles an hour. So we have to take into consideration the fact that it's got a really short wheelbase. Formula cars also have really short wheelbases, and the entire car has a slip angle, right? Not just the front wheels, but the back wheels as well. There's such a thing as chassis slip angle, and it takes into consideration all of the points of the rear suspension as well. And what we don't want is a car that goes around a switchback like an absolute beast. But then when you turn a corner on a motorway feel super twitchy and unstable and nervous because, of course, the 4 speeds of the 4 tyres are closer together when the tyres are physically closer together. It's why drift cars with a short wheelbase feel super dodgy and why they tend to drift big saloons. It's not just because they tend to be rear-wheel drive. It's because a big saloon has a long wheelbase that makes it predictable. And we've plotted it all out, and we went through this, and it was a nightmare to actually get the information and get the geometry to do all of this, and we couldn't do it properly until we had it all. And that's one of the reasons why the front wheels got moved slightly further forward when we actually came to do our steering and our front suspension mock-up and all of that. When it was over on the chassis table, that's one of the reasons why it moved further forward. It gives us a more stable car, but it also sorts out our Ackerman without having to move steering arms and stuff, because that's the one thing that we cannot do. You cannot legally cut or chop or weld steering arms. You can't do it. One of the reasons why like Triumph and Triumph Spitfire and Triumph Herald uprights and Mini uprights are so good, and that's because you can make a steering arm that's separate. So if we were to do this in a different car, you'd have to choose a steering upright as part of your considerations that you can actually sort your Ackerman out on. But we managed to actually get it right with fixed Ackerman, which is... I'm still kind of shocked about it, but it is right to what this car will be, because the fact is I'm not chasing lap times. I've said this since the beginning of this build. The most important thing about this car is that it is fun to drive, and it is designed so if it does get out of shape, it's not the end of the world, even in a car so short. And to do that, I needed not perfect Ackerman, because there's no point, like if you're going to choose when you're going to understeer, right? Do you want to understeer at 13 miles an hour, or do you want to understeer at 130 miles an hour? You know, I'd rather have a little bit of scrub in a car park, and yet on open sweepers, which is where this car would be like at its worst because of the short wheelbase, it'll be just fine, because that's where it will have stability. And if it doesn't turn in quite as rapid as I want it to turn in, I can give it a tiny little bit of toe. If that made no sense, sorry, go rewind it, watch it again. It's complicated. There are people who spend their entire lives studying this stuff. And I'm actually not the same person that started this. Like, the car now looks completely different to the episode 1. And I'm a completely different person than episode 1. I'm not like changed my personality, don't get me wrong. But I've had to learn so much. I thought I knew my stuff then. But in comparison to now, I know nothing. I knew nothing. And I probably still know nothing. And there are people probably that are, you know, F1 engineers and rally car engineers and stuff that could sit me down and teach me like stuff that'd blow my mind. But I've learned so much in order to do all of this. And it is an absolutely massive subject, and I have huge respect for the people who do this stuff for a living, because it's intense, to say the least. And it's no small thing. And it's changed my entire attitude towards home-built cars, because you really need to do your due diligence. You really need to get this stuff right, and I actually don't think that a lot of people do, and I don't think that a lot of people go into as much detail as perhaps they should. But I could go into more detail about the tyres and stuff like that. For instance, a lot of people talk about tyres and suspension, and you shouldn't have suspension in your tyres, right? In fact, this is a cool little tidbit. I put this up on social media once. But our tyres, because we have quite a bit of sidewall compared to most modern sports cars, which have very little. The reason we can get away with it, and the reason we can have suspension in our wheel, in our tyre, and use our tyre for extra grip and extra mechanical like stability and grip, is that
your tyre is an undamped spring, right? So it's a spring without a shock absorber on it. Basically, it's an air spring. Like, you know how you can get air suspension? Air spring, same thing. Like you have on a Range Rover, right? But, or a Tesla, right? But the heavier your car is, the more air you need in your tyre. And the wider your tyre is, and the lighter your car is, the less air pressure you have in your tyres. I think Formula One cars are really heavy now, but a few years ago, they were running at like 10 and 13 PSI. A lot of Formula Fords and like Formula SAE stuff and stuff like that, they run at massively low pressures because they don't weigh anything. They've got really wide tyres. We don't weigh anything. And we've got really wide tyres. That lowers that effective spring rate because the more air you have in your tyre, the harder that spring, so the more it's going to bounce because you've got every spring has a frequency. This is getting really nerdy now, right? But this tyre is inflated to the same air pressure as my Citroen 2C V tyre, which is a 125/15. Because it's so big, it has a little bit of stretch, so it should roll really fast. And it has a really low pressure. But that means that we get loads of mechanical grip. And we also get a really good slip angle out of our tyre, which should make it really progressive while giving us extra mechanical grip. Because the last thing that I want is a car that's super, super, super grippy until it's not. Like I said, I'm not trying to set lap times, we're trying to just have fun here. And so the whole point is that we've got tons and tons of mechanical grip, and the roll of this car, like the roll centers and stuff, and the roll stiffness is amazing. We're not going to need much of a front anti-roll bar, even less than I thought. So, yeah, it's weird, but that's because it's not like any other car now. Like the reason why every car now has super low profile tyres is because you can't have that air spring. You know, a Porsche 911 Turbo is seriously heavy now. Everything's mega, mega heavy. And so everything has to have these tiny little low profile tyres because your wheel is going to try and run off away from your tyre. So you need a super stiff sidewall and you've got a ton of air in your tyres. And so that spring is a super high spring rate. So its resonant frequency is super high, so that'll upset the car. Whereas we don't have any of that. So if it sounds very different from your car at home or your average sports car or anything like that, just, you know, remember that it's like 300 odd kilos lighter than an MX-5. There's no point in using numbers and using the maths and going through all the maths of this car because your car will be completely different. You know, the way of working it out is all the same, but you can look that up easily. The specific numbers in a car don't matter in relation to another car. You can't compare it all. I try and explain the principles at least so you can see what we're doing and understand what we're doing. And when you watch a car go around a corner, hopefully it gives you, if you didn't have that knowledge previously, I know there's a lot of engineers and stuff in the comments, but I hope it gives you a greater appreciation and a bit more knowledge as to what's going on. But yeah, thank you all for watching. Please be awesome to each other. If you've enjoyed all this, make sure you subscribe. There's a subscribe button down there next to the like button, so you might as well click that while you're there. Or there's a button that looks like my face. Liking this video really helps. It pushes it in the algorithm. I'm overwhelmed with how well these videos have been received since we've come back off our break. So thank you all for all that. You're amazing. Thank you for sharing these videos with your friends and on forums and stuff like that. Like, I couldn't ask for more. So thank you all for watching. Please be awesome to each other. And I'll see you all in the next one. Bye-bye.